Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. I'm Mary Massey, and along with host John Goodiron, who is out of the studio but calling in, we will be speaking for the next hour with Thomas Sleigh. Mr. Sleigh is a distinguished professor in the MFA program at Hunter College. During the last decade, he has worked as a journalist in Syria, Lebanon, Somalia, Kenya, Iraq, and Libya. In 2018, his book of prose will be published featuring his collection of essays on refugees in the Middle East and Africa. The book, The Land Between Two Rivers, Writing in an Age of Refugees, is being published simultaneously as a companion piece to the poems House of Fact, House of Ruin. We will invite listener call-ins at locally 707-923-3911, and if you're out of the area, streaming live, 800-568-3723. We do invite listeners to call in at any point. In his praise for The Land Between Two Rivers, Phil Clay, author of Redeployment, says, Tom Sleigh is our best essayist on political violence, whether discussing his wartime reporting or the victims of Stalinist terror or American racism. He applies a unique blend of intellectual fearlessness, moral precision, and an eye for the strange, the beautiful, and the deeply human. Even when I want to disagree with him, I find I must grow to be equal to the task. John and Tom, are you with us tonight? I understand that this is, I guess it's unusual for books to come out as both poetry and a companion piece of essays. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, it just came about sort of by serendipity because I'd been writing the essays over the last decade, and suddenly they kind of all gelled into a book, and then I also had a book of poems ready at the same time. And because, you know, the way that I work, what had happened is that material that was in the essays and part of the journalism, of course, began to work its way into the poems. And it sort of made an interesting mix because things which I would follow out in the poems rather obliquely then began to be written about more extensively in the essays. Mm-hmm. So it just seemed like a natural thing to bring the books out at the same time, and Grey Wolf, the publisher, was delighted to do it, and I'm very happy to have them out.
So about 10 years ago, you began to write long-form journalism about refugee issues, the Palestinians in Lebanon, Syrians in Jordan, Somalis in Kenya, and so forth. And you've also written about the situation in Libya just before the Second Civil War broke out. Can you explain how a poet came to write about these serious world issues? And John is on the line now, so I'll just let you know that, Tom.
Yeah,
John, hello.
I want to say it's glad to be. I'm very happy to be with you both. Tom, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing great, John. Lovely to hear you.
Good.
So we were talking about explaining how a poet came to write about these particular issues about the refugee situations in the Middle East.
Well, what happened is about a decade ago, I'd spent my entire writing life as a poet. And I'd written, some kind of highbrow hack journalism, reviews and the usual thing. And then I got invited to go to Lebanon and Syria back in 2007 in order to see what the aftermath of the 2006 war was like between Lebanon and Israel. And the main purpose of that was to see how the war had affected Palestinian refugees in both Lebanon and Syria. And so that's basically how it happened. I certainly had never been in anything remotely resembling a war zone, but that just tells you how green I was. So one of the things that you learn when you begin to write on refugee issues is that just because of the nature of their lives, that you're either going to be going to a place where there was a war, where there will be a war, or where a war just ended. And that was certainly the case when I went over in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Tom, I've got a question for you, and we can go into the particulars of how you came to write the kinds of serious journalism and essays that you're doing now. But I have something a little bit more global, a little bit more general for you.
Sure.
In thinking about your career, I knew you 40 years ago, and I followed your career for 40 years. You're a wonderful poet. You're a highly regarded poet, and won many major awards. But it seems like being a poet isn't enough. And I'm pointed to the careers of your friend Seamus Heaney, who was not just a Nobel Poet Laureate, but was a very careful observer of the Civil War in Northern Ireland. And I'm also reminded of the career of the other Nobel Poet Laureate, Pablo Neruda, who was a diplomat, a statesman, and a communist. And in accepting the 1971 Nobel Prize for Literature, Neruda said that the poet must achieve what he called, and I quote, the balance between solitude and solidarity, between feeling and action, between intimacy of oneself and the intimacy of all of humankind and the revelation of nature. In doing so, Neruda became not just a poet, but he became a poet at large in the world. He became a great man. Trace, if you will, the careers a little bit of Neruda and Seamus Heaney, and really kind of like how you're in their slipstream, in not just wanting to become a poet, but wanting to become an observer of the world and a man of care in the world.
I love the question, and it's so interesting that you should mention Neruda at such length, because I remember when I was a really young poet, even before I was a young poet, John, I ended up doing anthropology down in southern Mexico. And the reason why I was down there was to work with a woman named Gertrude Blom, who had basically established a sort of research center down there / hotel. And anthropologists from all over the world would go to her research center and stay at the hotel, which basically funded the research activities. And the thing about it is this is before I had even thought about writing, really. And I got to Mexico, and one of the things that immediately struck me was that I was speaking in Spanish all the time, and one of the people whom I read constantly was Neruda. And I loved Neruda's poems, especially the elemental odes, partly because of just the beautiful, clear, direct nature of those poems, in which he sort of talks about, very elemental things like tomatoes, very common, ordinary things, often addressing them. And one of the things that I was so struck by and so galvanized by in Neruda was that he had a way of both writing directly out of perceptual experience, and at the same time being able to talk about these larger social issues, but without, kind of thumping you on the head, preaching at you. And that was something that I immediately gravitated to. And what happened was I was so lonely, John, because I was speaking Spanish all the time. I was so lonely for the sound of English that I began to write these little sketches of the people around me, and one of the models was Neruda. So it's kind of uncanny that you should mention him in this context. So he's sort of been, or I've been in his orbit ever since I was 21 years old, and I've always followed his work. I've always loved it. I know lots and lots of different translations. The poems at the very end, Isla Negra, are among some of my very favorite poems ever. And just the example of Neruda and the fact that he was willing to try out so many different kinds of poetry. He wrote. He could write very, very super formal, very strictly rhymed poems. And then he could do something which was much less rhetorical, which he did in the Elemental Odes. I mean, I don't want to get too poety on you, but that's what we guys obsess about. But it was the two things together. It was the example of his conduct in the world, as well as his example of his conduct on the page. And when I was a young writer, I just published first book, late 20s, and I happened to have the very good fortune to be at a place called the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. And I had a friend there who was a young poet, and you know how young poets are. We were both together at Hopkins, young poets. As we do, we began to talk about what we read. And this fellow turned me on to this Irish fellow, Seamus Heaney, a poet whom I had never heard of. And weirdly enough, we've become, for probably 35 years, one of my closest friends. And I met Seamus when he came down to the Work Center to give a reading, and I just published a book. And he gave just a magnificent reading. And the thing that I loved about Heaney was that there was also a certain kind of continuity between Seamus and Neruda. And one of the things about Seamus is that, he grew up as the son of a farmer. And he was a northern Catholic. And through all of the years that I knew him, when I would go to visit him in Dublin, after he won the Nobel Prize, and, even before he won the Nobel Prize, he was an immensely, famous person. And walking down the street with Seamus was quite an experience on Grafton Street. There wasn't a single person, it felt like, who didn't know him, couldn't stop and talk to him. And he had the most beautiful, generous-hearted manner. He always had the time of day for everybody. He never stood on ceremony. He never played the eminent breeze. He was full of laughter and good humor. And it was just a joy to be in his company because you felt smarter, funnier, just more alive. And when I saw those qualities in relationship to the poems that he was writing about the Troubles, the kind of internal civil war that went on in Ireland for 35, 40 years, actually, most of his adult life, when I saw his ability to take pleasure in friendship, and he was extraordinarily gifted at it, that his love of domesticity and domestic life and just pleasures of, eating and drinking, laughing, that when you put that into context with the fact that he was also a poet who could take on the tragic element, and he could do both. And he, in a certain way, was we never had a kind of teacher-student relationship because he wasn't that kind of person. When I first met him, John, he offered me immediate terms of equality. That almost never happens between a younger poet and an older one, particularly one who was distinguished as Seamus. And for some reason, we hit it off immediately. We began to spend a great deal of time together because he was teaching at Harvard University in those days. And one of the things that I learned just by being with him was that poetry needed to do several things. And those are the things that I had first, experienced in Neruda, and then I experienced in Heaney. And one of the things that they needed to do was they needed to look disaster in the face, but they also needed to transform reality so that you weren't just giving a printout of disaster, that in fact you were suggesting an alternative kind of world in which, yes, disaster would still be tragic, would still be present, but it wasn't the entire universe that was filled up with it. And that's always been a huge model to me, to try to resist, the uniformly tragic note, because that really that has not been my experience as a journalist and in the Middle East. And God knows what people have been through there, and the amount of suffering that I've heard about in conducting, many, many hours of refugee interviews it's almost unspeakable. But at the same time, there was a really tough-minded, undiluted hopefulness about many, many of those refugees I spoke to. And I love that quality. And I wanted to record that in prose, and I wanted to record that in poetry. And I think part of the reason for that is I wanted to honor the, total bandwidth of their humanity, which is something that I very much learned from Shanks.
Yeah, well, it seems that you come from that tribe, and again, I don't mean to sound obsequious or anything, but you're part of that tribe with Neruda and Heaney. Neruda wrote once, and I'm just paraphrasing, that he stretched language towards transcendence. He would observe suffering, statement. He would observe civil war, and again, the civil war in Northern Ireland was brother against brother, family against family a lot, and he stretched these observations of a terrible civil war towards something like transcendence. Do you want to comment on that?
It's uncanny that you should say that, John, because Heaney had an almost identical phrase in which, in one of his essays, he said, the poet is stretched between, reality and transcendence. And Seamus had a beautiful way of talking about and this is something that he understood very profoundly because he experienced it in lots of ways in his personal life. And that is that when he decided that he was going to move from the north of Ireland to the south, there was a tremendous amount of criticism of him, just a huge amount of criticism of him for doing that. And one of the things that I think that he felt like he needed to do, he still stayed, deeply involved in what was going on. But at the same time, he had this beautiful phrase in which he said that rather than choosing sides, that the poet needed to be responsive to all sides at once. And I thought, in a situation which is so polarized, and I think it's a situation which, you can see very clearly in our country today, that the idea that you were going to have that kind of generosity of spirit, that you were going to try to be that broad and encompassing of as many different kinds of ways of viewing the world as you possibly could, without, of course, abandoning a moral center, that would be a kind of amazing aspiration for a poet. And also, the thing I loved about Seamus was he was just deeply, deeply concerned about the kinds of activities and pursuits that occurred when you were just an ordinary citizen between the writing of poems.
It's 21 minutes past the hour.
By hanging around with him.
It's 21 minutes past the hour. I want to remind folks that we are talking to Thomas Sleigh, and folks are able to call in at 707-923-3911 or 800-568-3723 and join in the discussion as Mr. Sleigh speaks about his new book, collection of essays on refugees, The Land Between Two Rivers, Writing in an Age of Refugees, and then his companion piece, House of Fact, House of Ruin. I wondered, Tom, if you would also, you included Anna Akhmatova in your second half of your book, who writes about the Kresty prison, which I think you believed. And I think it's interesting that it's a she, and I wondered, why did you include her, and were there many, or are there many women writers who look at these serious, grim, if you will, subjects?
Oh, I think there are. the reason I gravitated to Anna Akhmatova was because, first of all, I was absolutely fascinated with that period of history when they had so many great Russian poets, an entire generation really that was destroyed, basically murdered by Stalin, or taken off to the work camps, who died there. And the fact that Anna Akhmatova survived all that, and the fact also that one of the strangest things about when I was in St. Petersburg quite a few years ago was that because the Kresty prison is the place where Akhmatova writes the poem called Requiem, which is basically a commemoration of the people who died during the Stalinist terror. And her own son, Lev, was committed to Kresty prison, and I was in St. Petersburg, and I had gone by Akhmatova's little apartment, which she shared with a bunch of other people, because they still had to have it preserved as a kind of shrine. And then I read that you could go visit the Kresty prison, and that the Kresty prison was a working prison, which you could pay, like $5 and visit it. And I thought, I am definitely going to go visit the prison. Mm-hmm. And so you paid your 5 rubles, you walked into the prison, and up around you on a catwalk were all the prisoners looking down at you. And the prison, it was obviously a 19th century prison, and it was built in the shape of a cross because, of course, if you're committed to prison, you obviously need to be reminded of Christian repentance. And then there was a big cupola in the middle of it, where there were a lot of birds flying around in it. And the prisoners were there down the ground, and you took the tour walking among the prisoners. And they showed you all the cells, and eventually they even took you back to a little museum. And what they had in the museum, they had very beautiful chess sets sculpted out of bread, which the prisoners had made. They had a blowgun, which had been made out of toilet paper rolls, so that the prisoners would write little notes, mainly to their wives and families. And some of these blowguns were 6, 7, 8 feet long. That's a lot of toilet paper rolls to kind of glue together. And what they would do was they would put a note in it. They would put the blowgun, often having to go around a corner in order to find a window, which they could blow a message out to the world. And when I walked into the prison, next to the prison, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of these notes just there at the base on the sidewalk. And there were people, mainly women, sorting through the notes, trying to find something from the loved one who was in the prison.
Right.
And that seemed to me right there when I was in the museum and I saw that, and I was thinking about Akhmatova, and then suddenly there was a picture of her son, Lev, right in front of me in the museum. And not only that, Joseph Brodsky, a poet whom I later came to know, and who was another Nobel Prize winner, Brodsky had also spent time in the Kresty prison. And the idea that Brodsky's photograph was there, Lev's photograph was there, that I had Anna Akhmatova as this kind of model in my head of somebody who had found a way to address one of the big tragedies of the 20th century, but to do it in such a way that it wasn't a lot of bluster and rhetorical blather, but to focus, on certain kinds of elements of, daily life, daily life in the sense that in the very famous prologue to the poem, she's basically standing in line with other women, waiting to get to see Lev, And she stood in many, 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 many hours in that line, of course, and never did get to see them, which is actually one of the things that begins to start the poem. Mm-hmm. And then there's another woman in line with her who recognizes her and says, "Can you describe this?" And that has always seemed to me that how you answer that question, that's a complicated answer to that question. Can you describe this? Well, you could say yes, but then once you've said yes, then you've got to figure out how to do it. And that's certainly been one of the things that has been very interesting to me in trying to write about the situations which I write about, because, of course, I'm coming at it as a cultural outsider. But, just to finish with Akhmatova, the strange thing about it is that in her poem, and maybe you should beware of what you wish for, both half joking, and, sort of half serious, she says that she would very much like there to be built on the bridge, which is right next to the Kresty prison. They should build a monument to her. Well, Mary, I read just a couple of years ago that they have now closed the Kresty prison, and that they're going to be converting the Kresty prison into a hotel entertainment complex. And that they have indeed built a statue of Akhmatova in front of the
There's a poem there,
Tom.
There's a poem there.
There's a poem there.
Wow.
I mean, all you have to do is say it, but there's a certain kind of wonderful irony. And, of course, it's a dreadful statue. And I can just see Akhmatova, spinning around in her grave thinking, oh, my God.
Well, the dreadful...
I thought I was just writing a poem.
The dreadful statue is the second poem. I wanted to ask you about poets and poetry in general, Tom, and then we'll come back to the granular particulars of some of your work.
Sure.
It seems to me that that when I look at many modern poets, many modern American poets, they're just irrelevant. It's almost like reading Facebook posts or Twitter posts about what somebody had for breakfast or what their sex life is like, or I just don't care. Their poetry seems to be too soft, too emotional, too irrelevant, too small. They're writing about worlds that are very, very small. You're writing about the world at large. You're writing about the most important issues. You're writing about human suffering. How do poets become relevant? How do poets, take that step up to becoming important, to writing about what matters and what matters? What matters? What do we write about? What matters? And how do you step out of those Facebook posts about your life, which is what most poets write about, to what matters?
That's a question that I ask myself every day. Let me just tell you a little story. When I first started doing journalism, that was when I was in Lebanon, and I wanted to go down to the south of Lebanon in order to just to see what had happened, because in the south is where most of the fighting had taken place during the 2006 war. And so I luckily just hired a engineering student who was moonlighting as a cab driver. He drove it with his dad. And, I just thought, I just need somebody to take me down to the south because I want to see what happened down there. And the hotel guy said, sure, I can get you somebody. So he got me this guy, Joseph was his name. Very nice young man. And we got in the car, and he said to me, so where would you like to go? And I said, well, I want to go down to the south. Do you have any suggestions? And blazoned on the back of his taxi cab was written, Trust Taxi. I thought, I really have lucked into it. Trust Taxi. I will. Joseph, you're my man. And it turned out that Joseph had been, during the war, previous year, a member of the Red Cross, and that there was a small town in southern Lebanon called Kana. And when he said, would you like to go to the south? I can take you to a village that was bombed, in which a entire Lebanese family was wiped out by a quote-unquote stray bomb, and I can show you what I saw. And he had gone down there the previous year as a member of the Red Cross, and they had gotten the call that Kana had been bombed, and that there were a lot of dead civilians and a lot of people trapped in houses and a lot of wounded people. And so as we began to go down to southern Lebanon, all of the bridges were blown up. And it took us a long time to get down there. We had to go past lots of different checkpoints. And when I say checkpoints, what I mean is a bunch of tires stacked up, painted red, next to a little kiosk, with armed, with Lebanese soldiers standing by them, most casual thing in the world. And basically, what had happened is that Joseph had gone down there a year before, and he hadn't been back. And when he got to the city, his team was ready to go in. But this is something that people don't really know about how these things occur between enemies. And that is that the South, this was a village in which Hezbollah was the sort of civil authority, and the bombing raid by the Israelis had been going on, and finally his ambulance team was down there and they were ready to go in, but the Hezbollah authorities would not give them clearance to go in until they had gotten the all clear from the Israelis that the bombing was over with. Those kinds of intimacies between combatants I found just incredibly strange. So what happened is that Joseph then we got down there, he took me into the village, and with crystal clear recall, obviously the stuff had been burned into his brain. He took me around to each place where he had helped people. And he told me that one of the things that had been most disconcerting about going around, picking up body parts, putting them in bags, was in all the smoke and all the darkness, because it was still very early, you could hear lots and lots of cell phones ringing. And people outside of Kana were obviously calling their relatives and friends in Kana to see if they were okay. But the fact of the matter is, the cell phone was still working, but the people were dead.
Right.
And so what happened as we began to go around, he told me that story. He said he got to a particular place right in the middle of the village, and he saw a young girl who had been buried in rubble up to her neck.
Right.
And because he didn't have a shovel or, those kinds of tools, he just basically got down on his hands and knees and uncovered her up to her armpits. And then he thought to pull her free, and he grabbed her under the armpits. And I'll never forget what he said. He grabbed her under the armpits, and he picked her up and discovered that she'd been blown in half. Now, when he told me that, he looked like he was about ready to tear up. And, I said, hey, man, we don't have to talk about this anymore. And he said to me, he looked me dead in the eye, and he said, oh, no, Tom, I'll tell you my story, but you must promise tell it to the world. And
so that's what you do, Tom. That's what you're doing. That's what you're doing now. That's what makes your nonfiction work important. But as an American, as an American, who does America support? We support Israel. That's responsible
Absolutely.
for a lot of this
Yep,
carnage,
that's
right?
correct.
So from that perspective, how do you tell these stories? Do you bring? How do you drop your, American bias at the door and go pass through that door and tell these stories with humanity? How do you do it?
Well, for me, it has everything to do with resisting wanting to paint big picture things. I want to talk about the small, the local, the intimate details, the texture of the experience. I don't want to pretend to be an instant expert on things that I don't know about. I don't want to pretend that I have a certain kind of insider's knowledge, which only somebody born into Lebanon could possibly have. And one of the things that I think is most important for me to do when telling these stories is, given the fact that I'm an outsider, I'm confronted with a lot of uncertainty, cultural uncertainty, moral uncertainty, and rather than try to neaten up all that uncertainty, shove it under the rug, give a straight presentation of quote-unquote facts, for me, what is most important is to be honest and build that uncertainty, that moral ambiguity, into the piece, into the actual writing of the piece. And a simple example of that is one of the things I've written about in other contexts is the difference, say, between a political conviction and a political emotion.
Right, you're right about that.
Yeah. And so that's what I'm really interested in, is writing about political emotions, because a political emotion is what happens when a political conviction collides into a real-life situation. So, for example, when I was in Libya, I was traveling with a militia, and Gaddafi had been killed, and, I knew things about Gaddafi, but the longer I was in Libya, John, the more and more clear it became to me that, yes, Gaddafi was a monster, but he was also a buffoon. And if you go online and just put in Gaddafi plus hats, you will be astounded at what comes up. Gaddafi in all these unbelievably weird hats.
I liked his bodyguard detail. All those babes.
Yes.
Remember them?
No, I know that his all-female bodyguard.
Yeah.
And
they were all babes.
That's right. And the thing that's so strange about Gaddafi is that, if you're talking about Stalin, Stalin, his persona is the true evil baddie. Yeah. But Gaddafi, he's kind of both a clown and a monster. Yeah. And so one of the things that was so interesting to me about, being in Libya was trying to figure out how to both communicate the clownishness of Gaddafi without lessening the fact that he was also a monster. Right. And those kinds of contradictions, those are the things I like to write about. I mean, the very simple thing that I can tell you about Gaddafi is this. I met an Amazigh poet, and that's a Berber poet, but the word Berber is frowned on in Libya, and Amazigh is the word that they prefer. So I met an Amazigh poet, and I was asking him, well, what was it like to live under Colonel Gaddafi, otherwise known as the brother leader, otherwise known as the Rashid, the guide, otherwise known as, he goes on and on and on with all his weird titles. And the guy said, well, I'll tell you, Tom, what it was like. He said, when I was a little boy, we had maybe 2 or 3 television channels. And we had there was very little, children's programming. So, there was a particular story, an animated cartoon, which I really loved. And part of the animated cartoon was that there was this baby bee and the baby bee had gotten separated from its mother. And so I was watching all of the episodes about the baby bee, and I was at the very last episode in which I thought the baby bee was finally going to be, reunited with his mother. And he said, and you know what, Tom? Just at the climax of the show, they cut away, and there was Colonel Gaddafi gassing on at some party conference. So he never found out that the baby bee and his mother had gotten together. And he said, that's what it was like.
Folks, we have about 20 minutes left to go. We are talking to Tom Sleigh, and if you're interested in looking at his bio and books, you can go to www.graywolf, that's G-R-A-Y, wolfpress.org, and it's 43 minutes past the hour.
Mary, I wanted to jump in here and say that I went to Strand Bookstore in New York and bought a couple of copies of Tom's book. The essays are The Land Between Two Rivers, Writing in the Age of Refugees, about his trips in the Middle East. And his most recent book of poems is The House of Fact and the House of Ruin. And for anyone who becomes a member of KMUD Radio tonight, or within an hour of the show, I will make a pledge drive, a gift of these books to new members. So as many new members of this public radio station sign up within an hour of this show, the station will send you your choice of either the Book of Poems, House of Fact, House of Ruin, or Tom Sleigh's book, The House Between Two Rivers. Tom, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, again, Gaddafi, and so much of this is, out of the theater of the absurd and the ridiculous.
Yes.
But it's also pretty grim as well. I've been, I worked as a law enforcement officer with the Mendocino County Sheriff's Office, and I've been to the Middle East on a number of UN peacekeeping missions and treaty supervision missions. And I've seen a fair amount of atrocities and war crimes myself, and I know exactly what you're talking about. You have there's something called a disaster porn. When you see this kind of carnage, or in Somalia, say, when you see the famine, which has killed 250,000 people, or the cholera epidemic, which is going to kill upwards of 900,000 people in Yemen and Somalia, which is largely caused by the embargo of these places by the United States and Saudi Arabia, which Mary and I have done shows about. This is carnage on an incomprehensible scale, and writers such as yourself have been warned against what's called disaster porn. It's like snuff porn. It's just too much. It overwhelms the senses. It's just too damn much. How do you get over that? How do you get over just being overwhelmed by almost the pornographic nature of violence on this scale?
Yeah. The way I've tried to do it, John, and I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. When you're over, on some of these peacekeeping missions, where I'm sure you saw various atrocities and had to think about them. And of course, you've got a job to do. So, your job isn't to sit around and, think about your inner life. You've got a job to do. And it's only when you come back to the States, you have a little downtime that you can actually begin to process this stuff. For me, when I try to write about this stuff, I've listened to hour after hour after hour after hour after hour of refugee intake interviews, particularly in Nairobi. And the thing that interests me in terms of this issue of disaster porn is Saul Bellow had a term rather similar to it called crisis chatter. And it's one of the things I think that happens is when, in order to be able to make this kind of scale of suffering comprehensible is that the first thing that people do is and it's understandable. I'm not being critical here. It's just descriptive. But the first thing that people do is they try to reduce it to one or two or three images, which then become iconic, and then, for better or worse, get laid on top of everybody who's experiencing this suffering. And the fact is, one of the things that I learned when I was in Somalia, during this famine that you spoke of, was one of the things I learned there that, we were all familiar with photographs of, children with swollen bellies and their ribs are sticking out. And there's often, a kind of aestheticized, light glistening off their bellies. It's creepy and weird. And one of the things that I learned when I was there was, I watched this. I was at a feeding station and internally displaced people's camp, a place called the Sausage Agency, homegrown agency, and they were just basically trying to feed the starving kids, and the mothers and their babies and their young children were with them. And there was a particular woman whom I had spoken with, and her story was very, 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 I heard the story over and over and over again. And her story was simple. She'd been living in Mogadishu. A rival militia had come into her home. They'd taken her two sons outside. They'd taken her husband, and they executed them in the street. And you hear the story over and over and over and over again, a version of it. And then I was watching her after she told me this story, and her baby, probably eight months old, maybe even, I'm not, maybe she old as 2 years old. It's very difficult to tell because the children are so small, And so what happened is that this kid was really knocked out. And I had seen kids on the edge of coma because people were coming in off the desert to the huge refugee camp called the Dab. And the first time I'd been there a couple of years ago, there had been about 280,000 people there. Well, now there were 450,000 people there. And the camp had been built back in 91 for 90,000 people. So you can imagine what it was like. And, just the scale of the suffering, which, of course, you yourself have experienced, everything for me suddenly crystallized when I watched this mother and her child, and the kid was totally sacked out. And I thought, my God, this kid could die right now, because I couldn't tell if the kid was entering coma or not. And what happened was one of the matrons came along, and she gave the mother a nutritional biscuit called Plumpy Nut, and it was in a shiny silver wrapper. And, the kid woke up. He must have smelled it because she put it near his mouth. He woke up. She gave it to him, fed it to him, and he began to eat it. And, within 2 minutes, John, the kid was, alert. He was sitting up, and he had taken the silver wrapper and was, throwing it up in the air and catching it. And it's like he had recovered, the instinct to play just from the sugars.
Wow.
And I thought to myself at that moment, Sleigh, you don't know anything about the internal lives of these folks, And that's really what you need to know about. You need to know about the internal lives of these folks, and there's only one way to find out, and that's to ask them about it. Treating them as a kind of generic starving person,
right?
A generic sufferer, kind of,
and Tom, that touches on something that it seems like you almost warn yourself about in not giving a voice to the voiceless, because, I mean, fill in the blank. Because what? Because you're not them? Because you could never know?
Yeah, well, that's part of it, but also, there are a lot of self-appointed spokesmen for people. And, when you say you're giving, and I understand that there's a differential in power in terms of certain people have, much more access to media. In our culture, it's politicians, actors, and, athletes.
Right.
There's a huge differential in power in terms of people being able to get a message out. And so that's one thing. But what I'm talking about when people say, I want to give voice to the voiceless, you just want to raise your hand and say, did you ever talk to the voices about how they feel about being called voiceless? Right.
Tom, we have about 5 more minutes, and I wondered if you had a short piece that you might be able to share with our listeners before we need to say goodbye to you.
Oh, sure. You want prose or poetry?
Poetry.
All right. I'll read a poem. Maybe I could read a couple. Depends on the time. Or why don't I just start here?
Okay.
I'm going to read a poem with sort of an interesting history and relationship to this whole conversation. And it's a poem that I originally wrote. And the reason why I want to read this poem is because it's a translation from an ancient Near Eastern poem. It's not exactly a translation. It's kind of a very free adaptation of it. But in any case, it was about there was a very long epic written about the destruction of the city of Ur, and we're talking about poems which are written in cuneiform back in the during the Assyrian Empire. All the way back to the Assyrian Empire, the era of Gilgamesh. The kind of cradle of civilization. And this particular poem I found written in a French translation. There was a little cuneiform tablet, and then there was a French translation, and I found it in the basement of the Louvre. And it was about the destruction of the ancient city of Ur. And I had always thought that Ur was a mythical city. And so it was really about how, one of the, conditions of civilization is inevitably destroyed and it's inevitably rebuilt. And so I thought, well, I'll give this a try. I'll see what's what. Anyway, I it sat on my desk for a long time, and then I finally did a translation of it. And guess what? I had written it thinking it was just a general statement about, ineluctability of decay, and then the First Gulf War happened. And suddenly, something that I had written without any kind of overt political intention was picked up and became a political poem. And one of the things that I quickly learned after that happened was that, in fact, in southern Iraq, there is the great ziggurat of Ur, and the ancient city of Ur was underneath one of Saddam's air bases.
Oh, my God.
So, and of course, years later, I would be in Iraq looking at the ziggurat of Ur on my way to Basra in the south of Iraq. So here's the poem called Lamentation on Ur from a Sumerian spell, 2000 BC. Like molten bronze and iron, shed blood pools. Our country's dead melt into the earth as grease melts in the sun. Men whose helmets now lie scattered, men annihilated by the double-bladed axe. Heavy beyond help, they lie still as a gazelle exhausted in a trap, muzzle in the dust, In home after home, empty doorways framed the absence of mothers and fathers who vanished in the flames, remorselessly spreading, claiming even frightened children who lay quiet in their mother's arms, now born into oblivion, like swimmers swept out to sea by the surging current. May the great barred gate of blackest night again swing shut on silent hinges, destroyed in its turn. May this disaster, too, be torn out of mind.
Thomas Sleigh, thank you.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah, thank you, John. Mary, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And again,
God bless you. And again, for any listener who becomes a member tonight, your choice of Tom's the nonfiction book, The Land Between Two Rivers, his reporting from the Middle East, or his book of poems, The House of Fact, The House of Ruin. Again, Tom Sleigh, very much in the tradition of Pablo Neruda, striking a balance between solitude and solidarity, between feeling and action, between the intimacy of oneself, the poet self, and the intimacy with humankind. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom.
And thank you, John. Thank you, Mary. Keep up the good work. It's a wonderful to be able to talk to you guys and to have such smart, fierce, and funny advocates for us all. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. And again, I'd like to remind listeners that you can visit Tom's website to look at his many books and awards and so forth. His tour coming up at Gray, Gray, wolfpress.org. We are about out of time, but I wanted to give a shout out and a thank to the program director, Nate Dogg, who helped produce this program, and our wonderful engineer, Larry Lashley, who has been sitting on the other side of the booth helping us out. Heroes and Patriots will be uploaded to both Facebook and YouTube, and we hope at another time you will take a peek at that and listen again to this fine broadcast.